It was April 1989, and Jessie, at 9 years old, was spending the weekend at a friend's house. Her stepbrother, Jeff Pelley, was busy getting ready for prom, and her stepsister, Jacque, was at church camp. On Sunday morning, Jessie did what she always did, ran over to the parsonage for breakfast. But when she got there, the door was locked, which was weird. It never happened. So she ran back to the church, told everybody, and they all grabbed a master key to go check it out. What happened next left her completely shocked. Everyone was told to pray at the altar, and Jessie had no idea why. Then, when she finally made it back to the scene, it was chaos. Police cars were everywhere, yellow crime tape blocked everything off, and it hit her like a ton of bricks. Her whole family had been murdered. The Pelley family, everyone she knew and loved, had been gunned down with a shotgun. It was brutal. The small town of Lakeville, Indiana, was rocked to its core. That's when Jessie became an orphan in the blink of an eye. That day changed everything for her. It shattered Jessie's life. The Pelley family was loved by everyone who knew them. They were like the perfect example of a close-knit, loving family. So when tragedy struck, it left everyone scratching their heads in disbelief. The funeral, held on May 3, 1989, at the church where Bob Pelley had preached, was packed. It was so packed that people had to stand, and the media was rampant, snapping pictures as people walked into the church. Among those were Jessie's step-siblings, Jacque and Jeff. Jacque was a mess, tears pouring out of her, but Jeff seemed totally detached, like he was somewhere else entirely. Still, the real horror wasn't just that morning. It was the memories of what had happened. The family was found at home, and those images were burnt into the minds of those who saw it. Robert Pelley was found in the hallway with glasses nearby, with 2 gunshot wounds marking his body. Downstairs, the bodies of Don, Janelle, and Jolene painted a picture of sheer horror. The girls were shot in the head. Their mother was trying to protect them, but she did not survive. The scene would not be forgotten, haunting those who witnessed it for years. But who killed the whole family at once, and why? Did they have such a big enemy who wanted everyone dead? Or is it someone from the family? You see, questions are many, and answers we need to find out. Jessie grew up in a little church called Olive Branch. It was part of her life for almost 3 years. On one side was the parsonage, which was the house where she used to live. That place was too hard for her to go back to. It's like the walls were still holding on to all the traumatic memories of what had happened there. Jessie had changed a lot since then. She even changed her name and dyed her hair pink, trying to leave behind the sad, angry, lonely little girl she used to be. That girl was Jessica, and she didn't want anything to do with her anymore. Jessie's childhood started off like any other. She had her parents and 2 younger sisters, Janelle and Jolene, but when she was only 5 years old, her father died. Afterward, her mom married a preacher named Bob Pelley. The family moved into the parsonage with Bob's older kids, and things seemed pretty routine at first. Jessie hung out at home with best friend Stephanie Fagan and ran around the backwoods with sisters. To young Jessie, the Pelley family seemed like any other family. Then everything turned upside down. That brutal killing of the Pelley family happened on Saturday, April 29, 1989. No signs of a robbery or break-in were detected by the investigators. They immediately began interviewing family members, including Jeff, who insisted that he had no idea who could have done it. Jessie, who was just 9 years old, had a theory that her stepdad might have killed the family before ending his own life. She thought this because she remembered how strict he had been. But the lack of a weapon near Bob Pelley and the way he had been hurt quickly shot that theory down. After everything, people tried to help Jessie find some normalcy. A month after the funeral, she went to camp with a friend, but it didn't really work. After the tragedy, Jessica changed in a way that was hard to ignore. You could see it in the photos from that time, everyone smiling, but it didn't match what was really going on. Beneath those grins, things were broken. Jessica and her childhood friends were far from fine. They were struggling, each of them carrying their own weight of pain. Jessica's family thought it was best to cut her off from everyone who had been through that nightmare with her, to try and help her move on. Her step-siblings went to live with family on their dad's side, and Jessica was sent to live with her grandpa in Michigan. It was supposed to give her a fresh start, but instead it just made her feel even more alone. She wrote letters to her friends she had missed, only to be rejected. She spent her nights alone, lost in her own thoughts, feeling the distance growing between herself and the people she once called family. All of it was too much to bear, and she ran away to end up in foster care. It felt as though she belonged nowhere, that she was lost in the world. As she tried to rebuild her life, the investigation into the murders seemed to stall. By the time she was 13, Jessica tried to push all the sadness and anger down and just move forward. On the outside, she seemed like a normal kid, making new friends and keeping busy. But at 15, the past came rushing back when her stepbrother Jeff invited her to visit him in Florida. At this point, Jeff had a stable job, a wife, and a house. That visit is where he raised the topic of murders. He asked her what she felt about it. Without much of a pause, Jessica pointed towards his father. And it ended right there. Jessica was not aware of the fact that the police had always suspected another person in all of it. Fast forward to 1998. Jessie, now 18, was desperate for some stability. She hadn't had a permanent home since she was 9, so when she got her hands on a little inheritance, she bought her first house. That was a big moment for Jessie, like she finally had a place where he could belong. Not long after, her life took another twist when she met Tyson. Tyson fell hard for Jessie right away, but at the time Jessie was with someone else. A few years later, their paths crossed again, and they started hanging out. Eventually, they became a couple and had 2 kids. The children knew about the loss of Jessie's family, but the ugly details of the tragedy were never discussed. Jessie kept all that pain buried. 13 years after the murder of his family, the worst was when in 2002, Jessie's past came rushing back. One day, Jessie got a knock on the door. She opened it, and 2 detectives were standing there. They told her they're reopening an old case and asked her who she thought did it. Without thinking, she blurted out, "My stepdad." But they shut that down, saying it couldn't have been him. Then they asked, who else could have done it? That's when Jeff's name just popped into her head. And now Jeff, he always creeped Jessie out, and the guy had a short fuse and didn't think twice about throwing punches. So when the detectives said, "That's exactly who we think did it," Jessie got this sick feeling in her stomach. She couldn't shake the thought as they started diving into the case. Turns out there'd always been some serious tension between Jeff and his dad, and Jessie remembered this one time when Bob punched Jeff. The neighbors even knew something wasn't right between them. A few weeks before the murders, Jeff had gotten in major trouble for breaking into a house. His punishment? He got grounded, couldn't go to prom, and had to have his dad drive him around to everything. That was the worst punishment for Jeff. He cared so much about his social life, and that totally wrecked it. When the police asked him about it, Jeff kept denying it, saying, "I didn't do anything. My dad and I didn't always get along, but we worked it out." But something about the whole thing just didn't sit right with Jessie. He was known for having a nasty temper and loved to scare people. Jeff didn't get along very well with his father, Reverend Robert Pelley, and everybody around them could tell. They were prone to fighting physically, and the tension at home was thick enough that neighbors could feel it. Things were only getting worse in the weeks leading up to the murders. That day, Jeff worked the early morning shift at McDonald's, washed his car, and watched a baseball game on television. By late afternoon, Bob, Dawn, Jeff, Janelle, and Jolene were all at the parsonage, and Jessica and Jacque were visiting friends for the weekend. Jeff had gotten himself into trouble with his father, who was angrier than ever. Furthermore, Jeff was forbidden from attending prom. To worsen the matter, his father insisted on driving him to prom as if he didn't have any free will in the first place. That added to the flames of resentment that were already burning in Jeff's heart. Then came the unthinkable. Reverend Robert, his wife, and his 2 youngest kids were shot in the home, where their bodies were later discovered. As a result, he was interrogated. When they examined the timeline with his history of violence and the general dysfunction of his relationship with his father, Jeff seemed to have the motive and opportunity to do something horrible. They even felt that after killing the girls, Jeff acted like nothing had happened and went to prom as if nothing was wrong. Such a cold-blooded killing. Back then, though, in 1989, the case against Jeff did not stand. There was no hard evidence, no murder weapon, and no witnesses. The whole case rested on circumstantial stuff which made it tough to prove. So the office decided they wouldn't press charges against him, thinking they didn't have enough evidence. But one of the investigators had a feeling there was more to the story than it seemed. 13 years later, a new prosecutor took a fresh look at the case and decided there was enough to move forward. That's when Jeff was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. As the trial drew closer, people were very nervous, mainly about what might happen if Jeff was let free. Coming to Indiana for trial was really surreal for Jessie because she hadn't been back there in 15 years. Everything seemed so strange, and Jessie couldn't really remember who she was back then. As the trial continued, Jessie felt increasingly alienated. She had this fear of running into Jeff again. The emotional weight of reliving everything that happened was hitting her hard. Meanwhile, another witness, Stephanie, was freaking out over the possibility of bumping into Jessie in the trial. She only came there for her testimony and had very strict rules about not seeing or contacting Jessica. The trial started with the prosecution's case, which relied on circumstantial evidence mostly. They stated that Jeff was the only one who could have possibly committed the murders, and narrowed the timing to a very precise window. Their theory was that Jeff killed his father after some argument about prom, and killed the rest of the family to prevent anyone from being able to testify against him. The prosecutor worked through the timeline to support this. They discussed April 29th, prom night Saturday. Bob's house was filled with the excitement of teenagers preparing for the big night and showing off their outfits. Bob was a respected guy in the community, someone everyone trusted. But by 5:30 p.m., the house was locked up tight and no one else could get in. The prosecution said the murders happened between 5:15 and 5:20 p.m. Jeff said he left before 5, but witnesses said they saw his car outside the house after that time. His prom date even said that when he showed up at a friend's house around 5:30, he wasn't wearing his tux, and there weren't any photos of him with his parents in it. That raised a lot of suspicions. Then, his date remembered something strange Jeff said the day after prom at an amusement park. When she asked why he seemed off, he said he thought something bad had happened at home. That made people wonder if he already knew about the murders. So Jessie, who was out of town that weekend, got called in to testify. She recalled seeing the family's gun rack before she left for her sleepover. There was a bow and a shotgun on it. When the officers checked, they found the bow was still there, but the shotgun, the one they thought was used in the murder, was gone. They never found the gun, but something Jeff said during an interview raised eyebrows. He asked, "If I tell you what happened, would I get the death penalty?" That raised everybody's eyebrows to question whether or not he was involved. On the other hand, the defense argued there was no real motive, no weapon, and no forensic proof tying Jeff to the crime. They said the cops had jumped to conclusions without considering other possibilities. The prosecution wrapped up after calling over 50 witnesses, insisting that the facts pointed straight to Jeff. Everyone in the courtroom was on edge by the end, not knowing what was going to happen to Jeff. However, the jury finally deliberated for 2 days and returned with a verdict of guilty against Jeff for the 4 murders committed by him against Don, Bob, Janelle, and Jolene Pelley. Jeff was sentenced to life imprisonment, leaving behind his wife and child. However, this was not the end of the story. Jeff was given a sentence of 160 years for rape. Of course, the evidence in such cases is usually dubious, so an appeal was made, and the conviction was overturned on a technicality. There was finally some relief, but there was still a fear that the case could be reopened. Finally, in 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court intervened and upheld the conviction. The verdict was final with Jeff, and he was locked in for the rest of his life behind bars. So after everything that transpired, Jessie felt that her children were mature enough to tell them all this stuff about their past, such as how she lost her family when she was still a little kid. And one of them, being highly emotional, chose to look it up and searched it on the internet. Eventually, they discovered an article about Jessie's life and came across a picture of her mother. The child, not knowing how Jessie would feel, wrote a letter and mailed it off. Jessie initially did not know who it was from, but when she read the letter, it struck her. She was so emotionally shaken that she soon reunited with Stephanie. Honestly, it was like something out of a movie. Stephanie told her that she'd been looking for Jessie all her life, and that emotional reunion was like a turning point for both of them. Jessie still talks about that indescribable feeling of having someone come back into her life after all those years, and it didn't stop there. She also got back in touch with her cousin, Jamie Collins, who remembered Jessie as this fearless, full-of-life person. Their bond was so strong that Jamie suggested Jessie write a book about everything she'd been through. At first, Jessie wasn't having it. She didn't think she had it in her. But when Jamie offered to help, Jessie started to consider it. But even though on the outside Jessie seemed like she had it all together, her past trauma was always lurking in the background. While working on the book, things started to unravel. She got hit hard by the death of a close family friend who had cystic fibrosis, and it brought up a flood of old, painful memories. One night she realized she'd accidentally overdosed on her anxiety meds, and that sent her into an emotional breakdown. She ended up in the hospital, and that's when doctors diagnosed her with dissociative identity disorder, DID. It turned out that she had two identities, Jessica and Jessie. She'd buried Jessica deep down because she didn't want to deal with all the sadness and loneliness, and that caused her to lose some of her memories along the way. Jessie's recovery journey hasn't been smooth sailing. It's been more like a roller coaster with its ups and downs. There are good days when she feels like she's making real progress, and there are other days when it feels like she's taking 2 steps back. She's not completely healed yet, but she's definitely heading in the right direction. Her book, I Am Jessica, which she wrote with her cousin Jamie, was published on April 29, 2019, the 30th anniversary of the murders. The book has been a huge success, with tons of support from the community at their book signing events. Writing it gave her a sense of purpose, and she feels like it's been a way for her to really make a difference in people's lives. Now she knows that her survival wasn't just by chance, it had a purpose, and she's finally figured out her way after years of feeling lost. So what do you think about this case? Do you think Jeff had some serious problems since his childhood? Was not his crime too cold-blooded for his age at that time? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know some more gruesome murder just for ego satisfaction, watch this to know what really happened to Playboy beauty Dorothy Stratton. Subscribe to the channel for more. See you soon.